Good morning, still. Let's say May 13th, 10:20. We were going to continue some work on 949. Last week, Department of Taxes brought an idea to us about changing some of the thresholds. And I asked Julia to do some more work on that idea. Can you come share it with us, please, Julia? Thank you. Or should be here for the Carol.
Hi, Julia Richter, JFO. There is one other slide deck on the committee page under my name, property tax credits and maximum household income. I'll go ahead and share my screen. So as the chair mentioned, a week or so ago, tax came in and talked about proposal to change one of the statutory parameters related to the property tax credit and income sensitivity. So the chair asked me to put together some slides outlining a reminder of how the property tax credit and income sensitivity works under current law. Talking about maximum household income from income sensitivity, and then a few considerations. I've also been working on some modeling, but that is not fully ready to be shared with the committee today. So, income sensitivity under current law, we're talking about the property tax credit. We're talking about the education fund portion by and large. So we know that the homestead property tax has a credit based on income. This credit is applied to the following year's tax bill and is calculated based on the household's income and house site value. So essentially what the property tax credit is, how it's calculated, is we look at in the prior year, how much did the household pay on property? What was their overall property tax before subtracting a credit? If they had paid on income, how much would they have paid on income? And if they would have paid less on income than they paid on property, that difference is then what is the property tax credit. That difference is credited to them on the next year's tax bill. That said, there are a few different parameters that are used to determine how much they would have paid on income. And those are statutory parameters where if a household has a household income up to 90,000, then the property tax credit is calculated on the first $400,000 of their equalized house site value. If their household income is above 90,000, it's calculated on the first 225,000 of their house site value. And then at some point, it's always cheaper to pay on property than it is on income, right? Once the household income gets to a certain level, it's going to be always cheaper to pay on property. That amount is not set in statute. That's the maximum household income. We'll talk about more how that's calculated, but it changes every year based on a number of factors, and we'll go into more detail.
But you are going to do that at some point.
Yes. Yep. I think the bulk of the slides are talking about that specific. The bulk of the slides is talking about this 115,000 and how it's calculated. There's also another provision for households that have a household income of $47,000 or less, and that's called the circuit breaker. So the circuit breaker is an additional property tax credit or further tax credit, whatever you want to call it, that basically says if your household income is below $47,000, then you can only pay a certain percentage of your income to property taxes. So there's an education fund circuit breaker, and there's a municipal circuit breaker. The education fund circuit breaker can be seen in this table here on the left. So essentially, if your household income is less than $10,000 per year, then you can only pay 0.5% of your income to property taxes. And that difference is made up in a credit. Of course, that cost is borne by the education fund. We'll talk about that in the next slide. But we know all of these credits are foregone revenue, right, to the education fund. So the more that's being credited, the more that needs to be raised elsewhere. There's also the municipal property tax circuit breaker. This is borne by the general fund. It's an it's an appropriation out of the general fund. And this is the structure of the municipal circuit breaker. So again, that upper maximum household for the circuit breaker is 47,000, but the brackets are different, the corresponding percentages.
And they aggregate, right? So in a household making $40,000 even would pay up to 5% of their income, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And so thinking about it from the taxpayer experience, yes, thinking about it from the state experience, part of that cost is being borne by the ed fund, part of that cost is being borne by the general fund.
So can you remind us what's around that $47,000 statute?
John just did some digging. John, do you remember what year it was?
I think the 47K itself dates back all the way to the 90s.
Yeah,
But then the 47 itself dates back to the original language.
Nice.
and it's not increased by inflation within statute, right? I did look at if it were to be increased by inflation, what would it be in 2027 dollars? Of course, it depends on the inflation index, but it's around 100,000.
Wild.
So this is current law.
You want to say something, Representative?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it does help explain the exodus of Vermonters to the Arlington. I mean, when you look at who's leaving the state, it's those working.
So this is current law. Also under current law, there is the property tax credit lag, right? So this is when we were talking about how the property tax credit works and is calculated. The property tax credit that households receive on their bill is reflecting the credit that was earned in the prior year, right? So in fiscal year 27, the yield bill you've all been contemplating. Once a yield bill is passed, the homestead property taxpayers will receive a bill, and that bill will have how much are they required to pay in homestead property taxes, right? So that's that homestead property tax rate multiplied by their value. And then subtracting the property tax credit. But the property tax credit is the one that was earned in the prior year in fiscal year 2026. So that's calculated for FY 27 and saying, how much did they pay on homestead property tax in FY 26? How much would they have paid on income, education property tax in 26? There's a difference, they'll be credited. A reminder that those income, how much you pay under income education tax, when we're calculating that for calculating the credit, that's also locally adjusted, right? So just like homestead property tax rates are adjusted locally by your per weighted pupil education spending, the more your district spends compared to other districts, the higher your homestead property tax rate will be. The same is true for income. The more your district spends in per weighted pupil, the higher your income rates will be. I think that's a common misconception in the general ether. Income sensitized property taxpayers are also impacted by the district's per weighted pupil education spend. In the same way that homestead property taxpayers are impacted. And one more thing, I think we'll talk about this more in the future, but I do think it's important to keep in mind this lag when thinking about any policy changes to the property tax credit. Right? Changing the structure of the property tax credit is not going to be felt in the same year that it's changed, right? Because it's on a lag. For the most part, we'll talk about how that could not be the case if you were to make certain policy choices. So the property tax credit, I know you know this, you see this on the outlook every single time that you look at it, is a tax expenditure. It's booked right as a negative revenue in line 1B of the education fund outlook. The higher the property tax credit, the more, all else equal, the more that needs to be raised from property taxes. So in FY 27, it's estimated to be 134 million. This is the sum of those FY 26 property tax credits that are now being applied on FY 27 bills.
And I know the general fund is in our bailiwick, but I'm just curious as to what the expenditure is for the municipal. If you have.
I don't know off the top of my head, I could follow up.
So it's fine.
Representative Brady?
Being all else equal, property tax rates must be raised to a level that covers its cost. I say that all the time, or not in these words. People don't believe me.
I hear ya.
Or if I was closer, I'd give you a high five, but I mean, that people don't get that.
No.
Somebody pays for this. This cost of educating these kids doesn't go down.
Right.
And I won't even go to tips or current use or.
Let's not. We're gonna go back to here.
But I mean, it's right here. 135 mil.
And I think that that's an important point, and it's something that I did a lot of modeling and looking at last year and presented, I think, more in the Senate about it, but there are many property tax payers who receive a property tax credit, and in fact, it would be cheaper for them for there to be no income sensitivity than for them to receive a property tax credit, because their homestead property taxes are increased more than how much they are to pay for the total income sensitivity in the system than the property tax credit they're receiving. And this gets to that squeezing of the balloon, right? Expanding the property tax credit does not necessarily mean that all property taxpayers who are receiving an expanded credit are actually paying less in property taxes.
And it's one of the reasons I think that like all of this is so challenging, because it's very hard to direct the resources in the fund or the cost of the fund to sort of where they might best be covered. And we're gonna spend a lot more time talking about the balloon, right? Okay, Representative Burkhardt.
No, it's probably, I just remember Representative Feltus asked that question in our committee last year.
Yeah.
She said, what if we just did away with property tax credit at all? Would everybody, including folks at the lower income spectrum, do better? I think the answer was some would not. And so there's that messy chart that has some people going up, some people going down.
One way.
Yeah. And that expanded, the exact same thing happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And those thinking more about, excuse me, squeezing on the balloon and some going up, some going down, the messy chart gets to all of the different parameters that exist in the current system that are impacting the overall property tax liability, right? Every homestead, their property taxes, their overall liability is going to be impacted by the district limits and the per weighted people spending. All of the other spending decisions of the state, at the state federal and local level. Performance of non-property tax revenues, right? All of those things that go into the yield. And then that property taxpayers' house site value, homestead value, and their household income. So because of all of those factors that go into play, that's why squeezing on the balloon it's not a uniform impact. Yeah, this third bullet is what we were just talking about. So the total amount of the property tax credit is based off of those factors that we're talking about. The parameters that exist under current law, those statutory parameters, the yields that are set every year, and then those individual household circumstances.
Just an observation, I mean, I realize that homeowners pay property taxes. It seems that there's a trend now to rent, particularly for younger people. I also realize that, you know, they're paying taxes for their incomes. In many cases, those individuals may pay less in income taxes than those that have homes and properties. I don't know what point I'm making. It's just that there seems to be a trend for not owning property, particularly in, you know, downtowns. There seems to be an effort to build more rentals. And that has an effect, I would imagine, upon our raising monies for our education as well.
Yeah, absolutely, right? We, under current law, right now, there's the two property classes. This is all talking about the homestead property tax class, but there's also the non-homestead, which includes your apartments and rentals and your second homes and your businesses.
And the rental credit was expanded in the yield bill as it came back from the Senate.
And yes, and the increasing of when we are talking about increasing a tax expenditure to the education fund and property taxes need to cover it, the policy decision and in the yield construct that passed out of both chambers with the uniform average bill change, non-homestead property taxpayers, homestead property taxpayers are both covering that cost.
Yeah, I guess that's my point. They're not homestead and homestead property owners making up the majority, I guess, of the cost of.
Is that true, Julia, or do sales taxes and lotteries, did they pick up any of that increase, or is it only the rest of the property tax people?
So I think answering that question depends on how you're thinking about the education fund, and that's why I try to often say all else equal, right? So we've got the education fund, sales tax, portion of meals and rooms, purchase and use, lottery, all of that is going into the education fund as non-property tax revenues. Property taxes are the majority of what's funding the education fund. And so if we think about those non-property tax revenues as fixed, of course, they change year over year. But absent a policy choice to amend those percentages or get rid of exemptions or whatever it is in statute, that's how much we're anticipating to come in from non-property. So if a credit is expanded or if an additional cost is put into the education fund and more money needs to be raised and you've got those fixed non-property revenues, property taxes, all else equal, are going to need to make up the difference, or you're going to need to find a new revenue source.
Thank you.
So that was a brief review of income sensitivity under current law. And now going into the maximum household income for income sensitivity. And that's that 115,000 that we're talking about in the beginning, Representative Brannigan was asking about. So there's no statutory upper bound. right? The maximum household income changes every year. And it's the upper limit of household income where a household may qualify for a property tax credit. Tax and JFO calculate this maximum household income annually. And it's really doing long algebra. It's solving for a break-even point, at which point it will always be cheaper to pay on property than on income. Sort of a visual to think about it, right? Is you've got two lines with different slopes and they're increasing, and at some point they're going to cross. And at that point that they're going to cross, it's always going to be cheaper to pay on homestead than it is to pay on income. So we're solving for where those lines cross. And when you simplify all of the algebra down, where those lines cross, what that break-even point is, what is the maximum household income is really a function of a few things. It's a function of the homestead yield. It's a function of the income yield. And it's a function of that upper statutory house site value, that 225,000, right? So that house site value for the households above 90,000. Because we know they're not going to be phasing out below 90,000 and below where there is that 400,000. It'll be after the 90,000. And so then it's the 225,000. There's also some nuance here, right? Where also included in this is this statewide adjusted CLA and the minimum tax rate, right? Of a homestead, it's a minimum of $1 per equalized $100 of property value, 2% for household income. Simplified it here, I think there's like really sort of three big things to be thinking about: the yields and the house site value. Generally, this maximum household income has generally declined over time. Tax and JFO have talked about this a lot in the past. Essentially, it can be attributed to property values growing faster than income, and there not being any statutory inflation adjustment for that 225,000, and the setting of the homestead and yields. So I pulled this data. This is Tax. I should have included a citation. Tax publishes this on their website, but this is the maximum household income for income sensitivity over time. So you can see generally it's declining, going back to 2017. So that's sort of where we have been. And now thinking about, and this gets back to the proposal that Tax brought in on May 1st about the maximum household income. And Tax, when Jake first started talking about it, he was talking about this maximum household income, right? Using the different yields that are created in the two different constructs. So here I solved the algebra for the yields as passed by the House, which would result in a maximum household income of $108,500,000. And as passed by the Senate, a maximum household income of $109,000. What does that mean? Those numbers mean that under the Senate construct, if a household had income greater than $109,000, they would not qualify for a property tax credit, right? And household income is the sum of all essentially is the sum of all income of the folks who live within that homestead. One more little caveat on these numbers. This is assuming the statewide adjusted CLA of the SACLA of 70.33%. That may change before these forms are published. So there's a potential that there's a little bit of a swing, but they're rounded. I don't imagine that they will swing. So we see that would be a decline from the 115,000 that we see in tax year 2025. So tax brought up this conversation of if there were to be the goal to increase the maximum household income so that it's higher than 109,000, there are a couple of different ways to do that. We know that it's calculated at the point where it's always cheaper to pay based on property rather than income. We talked about how that algebra, the primary inputs are the 225,000 cap, homestead yield, and the income yield. So kind of like two distinct levers to adjust it are to change the 225,000 house site cap, what tax talked about, or set the homestead yield and income yield in a different ratio to bring up the maximum household income. And we'll talk about each of these in more detail. I will say I really tried to pare down the words on the slide, and I talked with our editor in doing so. It was challenging, so bear with me on all of the words. The we concept. So this is what tax brought in on May 1st. To amend the statutory house site value cap to increase the maximum household income. So they talked about increasing that house site value cap for households above 90,000 to be from 225,000 to 250,000. Intuitively, if we think about what that would mean for property taxpayers, it means that you all would be increasing the property tax credits for households with incomes greater than 90,000 and house site values greater than 225,000, right? Because if their income is below 90,000, or if their house site value is below 225,000, expanding a threshold won't give them a bigger credit. It will increase their property taxes. And that's because any increase to the property tax credit is going to increase the overall cost of the education fund. So this is what we've been talking about, squeezing the balloon. So by expanding that house site value, increasing the credit for those households that fit into this bucket, greater than 90,000 income, house site values greater than 225,000, would raise the cost of the property tax credit. I believe tax testified to it being around 6 million. I just haven't had a chance to finalize my modeling, but I imagine that is true. So be increasing the credit for those households by 6 million, which would then increase the amount of property taxes that the all else equal that needs to be raised by 6 million, which would mean we know households between 47 and 90,000 would see an increase in property taxes. We know households above the new break-even point would see an increase in property taxes. We know non-homestead property taxpayers would see an increase in property taxes. We know many, but not all, households in this grouping would see a decrease or would see an increase in their property tax credit, which would result in a decrease. So this is really talking about squeezing the balloon and increasing the maximum household income. So that's one.
And I just feel like as people are thinking about this, I just want to throw out, so like if, tax suggested we go from 225 to 250, it sort of immediately opens the question of like, why not go to 275 or why not go to 350? And like that would have a squeezing more balloon.
And the intuition holds true with the moving of the income thresholds too, right? If the 90,000 were to be moved, or the circuit breaker were to be moved up or down, it's all just talking about shifting.
I guess it's inevitable that we're gonna raise or increase our taxes, whether it be on income or property. But I'm thinking about why we're doing it, our educational issues. We really haven't fixed anything, and yet we're putting the cart before the horse, and maybe we're getting ready to fix our educational problems, but I guess that's what's going through my mind. with all of this. And I see the 225,000 for property values when the average cost for a house in Vermont is something like 500,000 or even more. Those are some of my thoughts.
And
so one of the things I wrestle with on with everything related to the yield bill, and I know I've said this before, is how much focus do we put of our limited legislative resources towards what to do with the yield over the next few years? Given that we are looking at a full change in the system in a couple of years out. And how much of that is like one-off changes and how much of that is a change that's a ramp and how much of it is trying to, relieve some pressure while all the other changes take place. I don't know.
I think hearing Rep. Page's comment, I want to just include one technical caveat, which I don't have on the slides here. When talking about the average home value, the 225,000 is included in statute, and that is the equalized value. So that is if a property were to be assessed at 100% of fair market value, it would be 225. That's just a clarification.
Let's go to the.
So that would be one manner to adjust the maximum household income. The other manner is to talk about those other two factors that we spoke about that go into that algebra of finding the break-even point. So because the maximum household income is impacted by the yields, you may choose to set the yields in order to increase the overall property tax credit and increase the maximum household income. So when looking at the yield bill and looking at the education fund outlooks every week, come in, you look at the outlook and it has that line where it says average bill change, right? It's got the non-homestead bill change, the homestead bill change, and the income average bill change. And typically, the request has been for me to come in with always aligning the average bill change for homestead and income to be the same, right? So homestead and income average bill change should both increase by the same percentage, 3.5%, 6%, whatever you're contemplating. That's a policy decision. You do not need to set that average percentage bill change for homestead and income to be uniform. You could increase one and decrease the other, vice versa. And in doing that, you would be impacting the property tax credits that are earned in the upcoming year and then applied to the following year, right? So if the goal were to be to increase the maximum household income, that could be done by setting the homestead average property tax bill increase to be greater than the income average bill increase. So essentially, you'd be raising property taxes more on homesteads than on income, which would then push out that break-even point to make the maximum household income higher. It would also be expanding everybody who gets a property tax credit, everybody's property tax credit, because you're not raising, because you're not raising income as much, which then makes that difference bigger between how much is paid on homestead and how much is paid on income. Jake and I have talked a lot about this, and we haven't been able to figure out a way to estimate an overall cost of shifting the yields away from that uniform average bill change. We can talk about the impact to the average bill percentage change, and we haven't yet been able to figure out a way to say, if you were to deviate the yields in such a way, it would increase the property tax credit in 2 years by X%. We know it would cost more. We know it would cost more than shifting that house side value from 225 to 250, dependent on how much you make them deviate. We don't know how much more. This would be another way of squeezing the balloon, right? It would be expanding the property tax credit by making it cheaper to pay on income, more expensive to pay on homestead. But in expanding the property tax credit, it means more needs to be raised from property taxes, which then means for some households, they'll see a more relief because they'll see a larger property tax credit than their homestead bill has increased. And in other households, they'll see an increase because the increase to their property tax credit won't make up for the fact that their homestead bill has increased.
And I don't know about everyone else, I regularly have people talking to me about how, 80% of Vermonters, these are random numbers I'm just making up right now for the purposes of this demonstration in my sentence. But 80% of Vermonters used to pay based on income and now only 40% of Vermonters do. Can't you fix that? And so that's would be one way to fix that. Whether or not people would be better off as a result of that fix is a very good question. And is not sort of one that's asked in the framing of the question I'm answering sometimes, which is interesting. I think there's an assumption that if people are paying best based on income, they're better off, but as Julia said, they're often not.
So in your example, somebody earning less than 90. They won't see an expansion of the property tax credits, gonna have an increase in their property tax bill, essentially to help pay for the expansion.
Under the tax proposal, yes. Under if you were to set the yields with a different average bill change, not necessarily.
That
This is another thing where, since we have such amazing GIS capacities in the state right now, it'd be really interesting to map. Because the acceleration of property values associated with scarcity is not uniformly distributed across the state. And the fact that that is true, I mean, again, this is the woman with the salt. We are gonna have economic development impacts that have nothing to do with education when we do this.
Every time we talk about the woman with the salt, I remember the time that we put lemon juice in my ex's coffees on April Fool's Day. So then we kept on thinking that the milk was spoiled, but it wasn't.
It wasn't.
It's like the best April Fool's Day joke ever. And eventually realized I needed to fix your coffee. Yeah, do you have anything else representative?
I actually, I'm gonna go back and agree with Representative Page, because I think, when we looked at the staffing data, schools are actually reducing the number of teachers they have on staff. They are growing administrators and they are growing special educators. And that is in response to our policy determinations. And every time we pass the bill, we create a new work demand. And it's just, we are doing a lot this session, and that is going to drive increases in administrative overhead. I just don't see how it does.
I also have another comment. Apologize for that. But, the emphasis is on, we need to build more houses. How is all this going to affect, increasing our houses throughout the month?
How's what going to be done?
If we're going to tax more on property, will that affect building houses and people wanting to own a home in Vermont.
I think it depends on the income of those people who want to own a
Well-
home. Yeah,
I mean, everything has a cause and effect.
so usually multiple in both directions, yeah. Back to you, Julia.
Okay. So that is talking about like the policy levers and how everything works. I've also included a few considerations. I think we've probably talked about all of them.
Yes.
And, so go through them. So timing considerations. We talked about the property tax credit and its lag. Under either policy lever, the impact on the property tax credit will be, won't be felt by property taxpayers or borne by the education fund until fiscal year 2028. Right? That's because in fiscal year 2028, we're going to go back and we're going to look, how much did a household pay on property in 27? How much would they have paid on 27? And then we'll credit, the state will credit them the difference in 28. So everything that we're talking about here, if it were to happen, it wouldn't be felt by anyone until 28. The other thing I wanted to note is that neither one of these levers are 1-year impacts. Right? So changing the statutory house site limit would impact the calculation of all future property tax credits and all maximum household incomes into the future until there's another statutory change. It would be amending statute to change that parameter. Changing the relationship between the yields, the homestead and the income yield would also continue into the future, right? Every time that I come in here with the Ed Fund Outlook and you all talk about the average bill change, it's always the average bill change compared to the prior year. So by deviating or changing the relationship between the homestead yield, the homestead average bill change, and the income average bill change, right now, if this is their relationship, and then in 1 year you say, okay, we're gonna make income pay less, we're gonna expand property tax credits, not do the same for homestead, there is now a new relationship. So next year, when we're looking at the average bill change, we'll be looking at it compared to that new relationship. So it'll be a relationship that would continue into perpetuity as long as the yield construct exists, unless there were to be another legislative decision to not do a uniform average bill change, which in theory, you could make that decision every year if you wanted to. It would just need to be a decision. So those are a couple of timing considerations. Squeezing the balloon, we talked about this a lot. Increasing the property tax credit for one group or decreasing property taxes for one group means that all else equal needs to be made up from somewhere. In the Ed Fund, it's made up from property taxes of others. We talked about also the fact that increasing a property tax credit does not necessarily mean a decreased liability for the same property taxpayer. Right? So if I pay $100 in property taxes gross and my credit is $50, right? My credit could be increased to $55. But in order to cover the increase in my property tax credit and everybody else's property tax credit, maybe my homestead property taxes would need to go up $20. So I saw an increase of my credit of $5, an increase of my overall taxes of $20. Netting it out, I'm seeing an increase of my property taxes, even though I'm getting an expanded property tax credit. Not the case for everyone who gets an expanded property tax credit, but the case for some. And then lastly, I just wanted to remind you all that Act 73 contingently repeals the property tax credit and replaces it with the homestead exemption. She worked on a lot last year. Is that homestead exemption tiered based on income, the incomes and the house site limit are pegged to inflation. And then any changes made, any of these changes that we're talking about now would no longer be effective once that homestead exemption comes into play, unless you were to also amend the homestead exemption. That is everything. Okay.
Make sure. Yeah. So we have testimony on a totally different bill at 11:30. I have historically always felt very hesitant squeezing the balloon. For all the reasons that Julia outlined. But I'm wondering other people's thoughts on whether, we should be diving deeper into this.
So the renter credit, which I think, I can't remember the percentage, but I think it went up to $3,200 something. That's the attempt to do what this is possibly doing. Right?
No, I think it's different. We're gonna take some testimony on that tomorrow. So both the circuit, for the renter credit is, both for renters. And that's a general fund expense.
Okay. So that $4 million is actually coming, okay, that's.
It was a reduction in the amount that was transferred to the ed fund. And, sort of, but what we said, the circuit breaker, which has not been ever adjusted for inflation, is also a general fund expense. And that is less of a, to some degree, less of a balloon squeezing, because it's more of a direct expense, if that was something that we were interested in looking at more. And we're also gonna have more testimony about that tomorrow.
I just think I hear you, and I agree about the balloon squeezing in part because we're talking about dynamic systems. So for example, the grand list in Norwich appears to be dropping in recent data provided by Mr. Feldman. Some of the recent data out of Bedford suggests the same thing. So people do respond. What I'm doing is creating incentives. I think if we want to bring down costs and improve quality, we have to target cost drivers and quality. I'm not sure that, what I worry is that we're gonna do things that may redistribute development and opportunity, but not necessarily increase it. And I think we need to just be very attentive to that. And I just don't know that we have the data to evaluate. It just feels very late in the session to be asking that question.
On the circuit breaker piece, I did some very quick math, and for being a household number, 2 individuals both making minimum wage would push that household over the circuit breaker. And so I don't know necessarily what to do about that at this point, but I think that's something if it hasn't been touched since the 90s, it's something we should look at. And I think that, not a super helpful comment in the moment, but I think this just exemplifies why pushing back, moving towards a homestead exemption by a year is not a good idea. We should be moving towards that system as laid out in Act 73 as quickly as possible, not taking it.
You don't have anything that we haven't covered, do you?
No, I mean, in this case, the statute is not especially useful to showing all the things that's happening here.
That's what I figured. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that I didn't forget some thing. Okay, let's take a quick break and then we're gonna pick up 328.